Good evening, guys. Tonight's project I'm going to discuss talks about the Boston fallacy, an analytical look at the Boston Massacre. Now, everyone knows what happened during the Boston Massacre. You had the British troops firing on an innocent crowd of people, killing five, wounding many, many more, and only now new evidence is coming into light that actually prove that the colonials were just as in fault in during the situation as the British were. And we're going to talk about the idea of the unruly mob. We're going to talk about the influence of Crispus Attucks and us and some of the other different topics that are not brought up in your normal history classes, but certainly are brought up in mine and other topics of discussion. Now, looking at the abstract, during the history of the American Revolution, the American Revolution, one of the most notable events to happen prior to 1777 were the apparent atrocities that happened in the city of Boston. Now, Boston itself is a very, very profitable city. It's a very, very profitable town. It makes its money off of shipbuilding, imports, exports, the fish market, all of the market systems, one being, the famous Boston markets that exist nowadays. But it was also a city of conflict and controversy and revolution because the Sons of Liberty are going to come out of Boston. Sam Adams and John Adams are going to come out of Boston. John Hancock, the town that is directly affected by the intolerable acts, all of this stuff is going to come out of Boston. During the early 1770s, Britain became agitated and more involved in the affairs of the colonies, especially Boston. You're going to see them occupying Boston and paying particular close attention to Boston and not really anybody else. With an increase in taxes and occupation involving British troops on colonial soil, tensions started to rise between the soldiers and the citizens of Boston. The climax of this tension resulted in the Boston Massacre, an event involving horrible human casualties, but one that has been shrouded in controversy due to first-hand testimony by Captain Thomas Preston himself and new evidence that conflicts prior arguments. The Boston Massacre was certainly a crime that was perpetrated against humanity. However, it was painted with sympathetic language and should be categorized as an unfortunate event and not a massacre. And what I mean by that is that researchers such as York, such as Farrell, a couple of my sources, put quotations around the word massacre. And you may wonder, why would somebody do that? It's a massacre. It's unfortunate. But when you look at the context, all of the events surrounding it, the agitation of the British, the kind of resentment that colonials had towards the British troops, it was kind of like the perfect storm when it comes to the idea of this event that happened. So a lot of people, a lot of historians relate to this as not necessarily a massacre because it's not a long range of people as far as the amount of casualties that were involved in the massacre. However, during the time it was the appropriate language to use in order to sort of stir the pot and like, hey, let's go get a revolution started. And a lot of people, such as William Taft, he's going to say that it was the it was the colonials, not the British, that wanted this to happen to prove that a revolution was needed. Now, I'd like to start off on a few different things. This is called the calm before the storm. The city of Boston is considered one of the most revered cities in the United States history. Boston is unique in the creation of the United States government, as I said, as many of the first congressional committees existed in Boston. The Sons of Liberty, the Boston Tea Party, pretty much everything that the United States is going to be known for as far as the starting of our country is going to be related to the Bostonians. Boston was the home to many revolutionary leaders such as John Adams, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. Now, what a lot of people don't know about John Hancock is John Hancock previously was a ship owner, and he was a very rich man before he became the notable big man signature on the Declaration of Independence. Now, as far as, the reason why for this conflict, it was an unwanted welcome. Through the years, British occupation of the colonies started to deteriorate the relationship between the crown and the colonials. The colonies, especially Massachusetts, saw they were able to govern themselves. They didn't have to rely on the British to do everything for them. And they saw a disapproval of British occupancy and started to push that. There were numerous quarrels between native Bostonians and the British troops. So people act like, oh, it was the Boston Massacre that was the first problem between the colonials and the British troops. There were numerous instances beforehand that proved that they couldn't get along. So this just didn't happen out of the whim. This was something that was brewing over the course of time. But none of the events prior to this had the effect that it had, such as March 5th, during March 5th, 1770. And the final thing, one of the final things that I'd like to look at is what's called the beginning of the end, is that in most interpretations it describes the actions of the colonials and the colonials themselves, that they are the ones that were oppressed. They are the ones that were, involved in the massacre and should be considered the victims. Well, if you look at Captain Preston is sourced in York, a source called The Rival Truths. He says that the soldiers must take care of themselves, as many of the mob members were carrying weapons under their clothes and would destroy us in a moment. Because what had happened is Captain Thomas Preston, one of his sentries, was under attack by the mob and 12 to 15 people. And then, that's a decent amount of people compared to being controlled by one person. He ended up gathering up his men and saying, we have to go and support our sentry. Well, what had happened is that the sentry was under the fire of the mob. And I say mob because it's been proven through many different sources, whether it be Farrell, whether it be York, whether it be our own textbook that we talked about, The Glorious Cause. Fitz is another one commemorating to the Boston Massacre itself. This wasn't a ruling assembly. It was a mob that was looking to start a fight and looking to cause a reaction. And Captain Preston testifies in open court that he was standing in front of his men, and it was not him that called for his men to fire. In all aspects, if you look at the one of my sources is entitled Henry Halko, the William and Mary Quarterly. It's a review done. It talks about the mob saying, damn you, fire. Why won't you fire? Fire at us. They're begging them to fire at them, yet they're reluctant to do so. So what people have to analyze, and now they're finding firsthand testimony. As I said, William, not Taft, it was William Taint, a citizen of Boston, discusses the idea that people still continued into the street even after, and they're starting to throw snowballs, and the British soldiers starting to get a little antsy, ended up discharging a weapon, and then the second discharge and the third discharge. And the next thing that I'd like to bring up is the people that were involved. Now, many people don't analyze the importance of a man called Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks, you can look at his source that I have. The source is Karsten Fitz. It's commemorating Crispus Fitz, a visual memory and representation of the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks was not a Native American. He was an African American that was involved. Now, they talked about an African American being involved in this massacre. However, when you look at the portrayal of it in pictures, you don't always see an African American at the front of the line as most people say that he was. Crispus Attucks was a notable African American that supposedly was at the front of this mob and was one of the first ones shot by Captain Preston's men. But in depictions of it in many photos, there is no African American male at the front. So you can see that there's conflicting evidence, where in one depiction they want to have you sympathize and, oh, woe is us as the unfortunate people that had been murdered by the British troops, and then other that says, well, maybe society wasn't ready for an African American to be the poster child for the Boston Massacre. So you can see, as I said, the conflicting evidence in which people say it was a fully legal assembly. Then you have an unruly assembly compared to Captain Preston saying he didn't give his men the order to fire. It was the mob that was telling them to fire. And then even the depiction where you had an African American male who was the leader or was considered a leader of this bunch of ruffians by O.M. Dickerson, talks about how the mob was characterized as this heathen group of criminals compared to the guys that were just defending themselves against this heathen act. And then later, the troops that were put on trial were represented by John Adams, who, if you look at another one of my sources, both in John Farrell's Milibus Horatio, it talks about how John Adams thought that he had a duty to stand up for these men because he's quoted in saying in that source that no free man should ever lack counsel. That is the one thing that a free man should never lack. And I kind of commend him on that because he was a man of integrity. He was a man of democracy. Him and his cousin Sam Adams were both fighting for the idea of American freedom. He took this case and based it off of a tale of Cicero, and that goes into more of the source that I just mentioned, where a guilty man, through proof of evidence, is found that he is actually innocent. And that's what his goal was to prove that these men who were seen as initially guilty were actually innocent. And I just wanted to bring this up because most people look at the Boston Massacre as an event of woe is me, British brutality, when in actuality it was a event that was caused by our own colonial mob, armed with rope, clubs, pitchforks, ice, snowballs, whatever it may be, attacking a century that was simply defended by his own people. His people took up arms, being the British troops and being led by Captain Preston. John Adams went forward with this and was able to defend these men. 2 were convicted of manslaughter. The others were acquitted. But even that, people still have a problem with this, that don't give them, they didn't mean to kill anybody. That's why you give them the charge of manslaughter, not first-degree murder. They had no intent. The mob has been seen throughout many sources to have intent of starting this riot. But when you actually look at the context and the new sources that I've put out, the British were simply defending themselves from an unruly mob that was armed to the teeth and that could easily destroy them, compared to an unruly mob that was looking to start a fight and looking to make an example out of both themselves and the British troops. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this analytical look. Really look into my sources. They do a great job in analyzing the topic itself. And I hope that you guys were able to see some of the different aspects of the Boston Massacre that maybe you didn't know about. Have a very good night, and I will talk to you guys later.